The rain here doesn't fall so much as it materializes. It hangs in the air, a constant fine mist that clings to the ancient firs and settles on your skin like a second, colder layer. Most people who visit Snoqualmie Roosevelt National Park talk about the silence, but it's not silent. If you listen, really listen, you can hear the perpetual drip of water from moss-laden branches, the sigh of wind through the canopy 1,000 feet up, the wet rustle of something small in the undergrowth. It's a living quiet, and for the first few years I found a kind of peace in it, a way to quiet the noise in my own head. Now the quiet just feels heavy. It feels like it's waiting. My week started like any other. Trail maintenance checks, clearing fallen branches from the main loop, reminding tourists to pack out their trash and not to feed the jays. It's a necessary facade, the part of the job that keeps me grounded in the world most people live in. The world where the greatest danger is a sprained ankle or getting turned around for an hour. I perform my duties methodically, a comforting rhythm of tasks against the backdrop of the park's immense, indifferent beauty. The rhythm broke on Tuesday. It was a silver sedan, parked at the far end of the Osprey Point lot, the most remote trailhead access on the park's western edge. It was clean, a late-model Honda. Too clean for a car that had been here since the weekend. I ran the plates. Amelia Reed, 28, from Seattle, a solo hiker. Her backcountry permit was on the dash, filled out neatly. Destination, Eagle Ridge Loop. Return date, Monday. It was Tuesday afternoon. A cold, familiar knot tightened in my gut. Eagle Ridge Loop is a well-marked, 14-mile circuit. Challenging, but straightforward. People don't just vanish from it. Not unless they wander. Not unless they find a path that isn't on the map. There's an unspoken rule among the handful of us who've been here long enough. You don't talk about it. You don't write it down. But you know it, like you know the feel of a coming storm. Some parts of this forest are wrong. There are places where the trail seems to invite you, a clear, easy path winding between behemoth cedars, carpeted in soft moss. It looks like every other trail in the park, but it isn't on any survey. It isn't going anywhere you'd want to go. People who take that trail, they get found eventually. Just not in one piece. Not mentally, anyway. My satellite phone buzzed. It was Chief Ranger Thompson. His voice was tired, stripped of any real surprise. "Barrett, you at Osprey Point?" "I am," I said, my gaze fixed on the empty car. "Silver Honda. Looks like we have an overdue." There was a pause, the kind of weighted silence that says everything that can't be said over a recorded line. "Right. Begin a standard search and rescue protocol. I want your team sweeping Eagle Ridge, starting from the trailhead. I'll coordinate Ariel if she's not found by morning." "Understood," I said. Standard protocol. A charade. A well-rehearsed play for an audience that didn't exist. We would search the marked trail. We would call her name into the vast, absorbent quiet. We would find nothing. It was all part of the process, the necessary procedure before the real job began. The retrieval. Hanging up, I walked to my truck and began methodically preparing my pack. Extra water, first aid, emergency blanket, signal flare. Each item was a lie. I felt a familiar wave of weary resignation wash over me. This was my penance, I suppose. The atonement I'd been looking for when I took this job. I used to guide people through the wilderness, promising them safety. Now I guide them out of it, after it's far too late, leaving a part of them behind in the deep woods. I drove back to the main station and briefed the search volunteers, my face a stoic mask I'd perfected over the years. Then I led them to the official start of the Eagle Ridge Loop. Standing under the big wooden sign, In the misty rain, I looked past the marked path and into the deep, gathering shadows of the forest beyond. The others saw trees. I saw a cage. And I knew, with a certainty that made my bones ache, that somewhere in that vast green labyrinth, Amelia Reed had already been lost for good. My search wasn't for her. It was for what was left. Greg was already waiting for me at the trailhead, leaning against the damp wood of the information kiosk. He gave a slow, deliberate nod as my truck crunched to a stop on the gravel. His face was a road map of creases etched by 60 years of high-altitude sun, and the kind of worry that settles deep in the bones. His eyes, though, told the real story. Behind the practiced calm of a senior ranger, they held the same weary resignation I saw in my own mirror. He was one of the few who knew. "Morning, Barrett," he said, his voice a low rumble drowned by the immense silence of the forest. Greg. No more words were needed. He pushed himself off the kiosk and grabbed his pack. "Figured we'd start with the switchbacks on the eastern ridge. High probability area. Folks usually get turned around up there." It was the first move in our well-rehearsed play. The eastern ridge was miles from the pullout where Amelia Reed's sedan sat collecting pine needles. We were heading in the opposite direction of where her trail had truly ended. This part of the job was all theater, a performance for the official record, for the other rangers who still believed people vanished because they were careless or unlucky. We had to be seen searching the logical spots, making the proper radio reports, filling out the forms with believable reasons. We had to buy time. As we started up the path, the air turned thick and heavy, smelling of wet earth and rotting leaves. The constant drip of water from moss-covered branches was the only sound in the cathedral of old-growth firs. It used to bring me peace. Now it was just a clock ticking down. "Looks like she was hiking alone," Greg said, his eyes fixed on the trail. A statement, not a question. "That's what the trail register says," I replied. "Experienced, according to her waiver." Greg made a sound in his throat, part sigh, part scoff. "Experience doesn't help much, does it?" The way he said it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the damp morning. It threw me back 8 years, to my first retrieval. I'd been in the job less than 6 months, still green, still believing my biggest problem was tourists trying to pet the bears. Then a college kid, a cross-country runner named Leo, vanished. My boss then, a lean, wiry guy named Carl, took me on that search. I remember finding him. He wasn't injured in a ravine or huddled under rocks for shelter. He was just standing in a small clearing, unnaturally quiet, his head tilted back as if listening to something way up above the trees. Carl had put a hand on my chest, stopping me before I could shout. "Just watch a second," he'd whispered, his voice dry as old leaves. Leo hadn't moved. He was as still as the ancient trees. A department store dummy dropped in the woods. When we got closer, I saw his eyes. I expected fear or relief. Instead, I saw nothing. They weren't his eyes anymore. They were the color of fool's gold, flat and metallic, empty of any light. A living person, physically whole, but an abandoned shell. It was the most obscene thing I'd ever seen. "Don't touch him yet," Carl had said, his voice cold, like it was a checklist. He walked me through it. The sedation, the careful check for injuries, which you never find, the special words for the radio. Exposure, we'd say. Disoriented. Lies. Every word. "Your job isn't to ask why," Carl told me later, as we loaded the placid young man onto the gurney. "It isn't to understand. You're a janitor, Barrett. We just clean up the mess." A branch snapped under Greg's boot, jerking me back. He glanced back, his face hard to read. "You doing okay?" "Fine," I said, my voice flatter than I meant. "Just running the playbook." He nodded, accepting the answer. "I'm doing my job. Holding it together." The next few hours were just that. We hiked meaningless loops, our boots scuffing the ground for show. We called in our positions over the radio, calm and professional, painting a picture of a search that was finding nothing. All the while, the knot in my stomach twisted tighter. We weren't searching for a person. We were waiting for the alert, waiting for our play to end so the real grim job could start. The afternoon light was starting to fade under the dense trees when the sound finally came. Not the drip of water or the wind in the leaves. It was the sharp, unwelcome crackle of my chest radio. A young ranger's voice, tight with the nervous energy I knew too well, cut the static. "Dispatch, this is 7 Kilo. I think I found her. I've got a visual on the missing hiker." Greg and I stopped dead, our made-up search forgotten. "Confirm location, 7 Kilo, the dispatcher replied, steady. A pause, the sound of a map. "Yeah, that's the strange part. Coordinates are 48.31 north, 121.55 west. She's miles off the Cascade Loop, near Sector 9. She's not moving, just standing here." Sector 9. Our name for the dead zone, the place next to the ghost trail. Greg looked at me. His expression was grim, the worn ranger gone. Just the stone face of the custodian that was always underneath. Not a word was needed. The performance was over. We didn't need to say anything over the comms. I just keyed the mic twice, a crisp double-click that meant acknowledged. Greg cut the radio off, drowning the younger ranger's nervous voice in a burst of static. The cab of the departmental truck was suddenly very quiet, filled only with the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers pushing away the persistent drizzle. The forest outside was a blur of dark green and brown, colors bleeding into one another in the failing light. "Evans," Greg said, his voice flat. He was staring straight ahead, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "He's a good kid. Too good." I knew what he meant. Evans was sharp, earnest. He still believed his job was about lost hikers and trail maintenance. He still saw the park as a place of simple terrestrial dangers, a place you could understand. The drive to the access road for Sector 9 took 20 minutes. We passed the spot where they'd found Amelia Reed's car hours earlier, the empty space now feeling like a hollow socket. Greg handled the truck with a grim efficiency, turning onto a narrow, rutted track nearly swallowed by ferns and salmonberry bushes. The branches scraped along the side of the truck, a sound like fingernails dragging down a chalkboard. He killed the engine and we sat for a moment in the amplified silence of the deep woods. The only sound was the incessant dripping of water from the ancient cedars, a slow, steady clock ticking towards nothing. "Standard retrieval," he said, not looking at me. It wasn't an order, it was a ritual, the final recitation of the rules before stepping into the chapel. "Standard retrieval," I repeated, my voice sounding hollow even to me. We found Ranger Evans about a quarter-mile in. He was pacing beside a massive, moss-covered Douglas fir, clutching his radio like a lifeline. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He looked relieved to see us, and then immediately intimidated when he saw Greg's expression. "Mr. Connolly," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "She's just over here. I tried talking to her, but she won't even look at me. It's like I'm not here." Greg clapped a heavy hand on the kid's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look reassuring, but was really just a way to steer him back towards the trail. "You did good work, Evans. Real good. We'll take it from here. Protocol for potential dissociative episodes. Families requested privacy." The lie was smooth, practiced. Evans nodded, clearly wanting to believe it. He glanced past us, back towards the woman, a flicker of profound unease in his eyes. He knew something was wrong on a level he couldn't articulate. He just didn't have the words for it yet. We watched him retreat, his footsteps growing faint until they were swallowed completely by the forest. Then we turned. She was exactly where he'd said, standing in a small, unnaturally clear patch of forest floor. The ground here was a thick carpet of rust-colored needles, and she stood upon it as if she were a statue placed there by a careful hand. Her name was Amelia Reed. She was wearing practical hiking gear, good boots, a blue waterproof jacket. Her dark hair was matted with dampness and pine needles, and her head was tilted back, her face aimed at the impenetrable ceiling of the canopy, as if she were listening to a conversation happening 1,000 feet above. She was perfectly still, not tense, not relaxed, just absent. The only movement was the slow drift of mist curling around her boots. We approached slowly. I've done this 11 times now, and the silence is always the worst part. It's not just quiet. It's a dead space, a vacuum where the normal sounds of the woods, the chitter of a squirrel, the call of a raven, the drone of insects, should be. Around her, there was only the gentle hiss of our own breathing. Greg stood watch while I performed the check. It was part of the procedure, a remnant from a time when we thought these people might be physically harmed. I knelt in front of her, careful not to touch her. Her expression was placid, almost serene, and her eyes were open. They were a flat, mesmerizing gold. Not the color of honey or amber. It was the color of pyrite, of polished brass, a metallic sheen that had replaced the soft organic brown they'd once been. There was no depth to them. They didn't focus on the canopy so much as reflect it in a dull, burnished curve. It was the most profound emptiness I had ever witnessed, a complete erasure of the person who had once looked out from behind them. My breath hitched. It always did. I checked her pulse, strong, steady. Her skin was cool but not hypothermic. No marks, no cuts, no sign of a struggle. There never was. They were always found like this, pristine vessels, returned unopened. I reached into my pack for the med kit, for the syringe and the vial of high-dosage sedative. As I moved closer, something caught the weak light. A fine dusting of shimmering particles on the shoulder of her jacket and clinging to the strands of her hair near her temple. It looked like pollen, but it had a faint coppery glint. I'd never seen this before. None of the reports, none of Carl's original warnings had ever mentioned it. A cold, terrible curiosity bloomed in my chest, a violation of every rule I was supposed to live by. Never engage, never investigate, only contain. Greg had his back to me, scanning the perimeter. His training was to watch the trail, to ensure we weren't disturbed. My job was the victim. My hands moved on their own, a quiet betrayal. I palmed the small multi-tool from my belt pouch. With a flick of my thumb, I opened the tiny, sharp scissors. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. In one swift, furtive movement, I snipped a 1-inch square of fabric from the underside of her sleeve, where the golden dust was thickest. I pinched the small swatch between my thumb and forefinger and shoved it deep into the change pocket of my jeans. The fabric felt oddly warm against my skin. It was a secret I now held from the only other person on earth who truly understood the weight of this place. I had crossed a line. I had taken a piece of it with me. The drive to the clinic was a silent 16-mile purgatory. Greg gripped the wheel, his knuckles white on the leather, his eyes fixed on the winding strip of asphalt. I sat beside him, the passenger seat a cage. In the back, under a heavy sedative, was the shell of Amelia Reed. That whole process, the practiced and cold rhythm of it, felt dirtier this time. It wasn't her empty, golden stare that haunted the space between us, but the small, coarse square of fabric I'd palmed from her sleeve. It sat in the zipped pocket of my jacket, a tiny, forbidden weight against my ribs. A secret from the man who shared the deadliest secret of all. The clinic looked little more than an oversized cabin with a satellite dish, tucked away in a valley that had spotty cell service on a good day. Dr. Alistair Finch waited for us on the porch, his face looking older and more collapsed with each passing year. He was a retired city surgeon who'd wanted a quiet life in the mountains. We'd given him something else entirely. "Another one?" he asked, his voice as thin as autumn leaves. He didn't need an answer. Greg shut off the engine. "Usual presentation, Alistair." Finch nodded, his eyes avoiding mine as I helped him and Greg get Amelia onto a gurney and inside. She felt light, her body pliant and unresisting. The official story would be written and filed before morning. Severe dehydration, hypothermia leading to a long state of confusion, a tragic but believable accident. Believable enough for a family 1,000 miles away who just wanted an answer, any answer, that didn't involve their daughter becoming a ghost that still breathed. While Finch worked, filling out paperwork that would eventually go to a county-level contact who knew not to ask questions, I stood by the window, staring out at the solid wall of Douglas firs. The fabric swatch in my pocket felt unnaturally warm. I was sure it was my imagination. "You're quiet, Barrett," Greg said, his voice low. He leaned against the door frame, watching me intently. "Long day," I lied. He just grunted, accepting the lie because it was easier that way. We were all caught in a web of easy lies. I drove my own truck back to my station cabin, leaving Greg to finish the handoff. The night pressed in heavy, the dense woods on either side of the road swallowing the beam of my headlights. Every shadow seemed to twitch. The deep quiet of the park, something that had once been my solace, now felt like a held breath. It was the silence of a room right after a scream. Inside my cabin, the familiar smell of wood smoke and damp wool did little to calm me. I felt like an intruder in my own life. I dropped my keys on the counter, the small clatter unnaturally loud. Then my hand went to my jacket pocket. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the piece of Gore-Tex fabric. In the yellow light of the single overhead bulb, the stuff clinging to it was barely visible. A fine, glittering dust, the color of fool's gold. My predecessor, Mac, had given me the rules on my first day. His voice had been flat, empty. You don't touch them more than you have to. You don't ask why. You don't take souvenirs, you just clean up. You are a custodian, nothing more. Tonight I was more than that. My hidden curiosity, the flaw I'd tried so hard to bury, had clawed its way out. From a dusty footlocker I grabbed the cheap microscope I'd bought years ago to check pine trees for fungal blights. It was little more than a toy, but it was all I had. I placed the fabric piece on the stage, My heart hammered against my ribs like a frantic bird. Holding my breath, I leaned in close and put my eye to the lens. It wasn't dust, not pollen, not any mineral I recognized from my geology guides. Under the weak zoom, the tiny bits resolved into clear shapes. They were impossibly complicated, glowing faintly from within. Geometric, but in a way I couldn't place. They looked less like crystals and more like tiny, frozen blueprints for cathedrals built by insects. Sharp angles merging with flowing curves, making patterns that hinted at a language or a purpose that hurt my brain to see. They clustered together in groups that weren't random. They were arranged, organized, designed. A wave of dizziness hit me. I jerked back from the eyepiece, gasping. This wasn't natural, like a storm or a rock slide. This was something else. A leftover. The exhaust from an engine I couldn't fathom. The sheer, terrifying awe of it buckled my knees. I felt like an ant that had just found a microchip, completely unable to grasp the intelligence behind its creation, knowing only that it was profoundly and fundamentally other. That night, sleep wasn't a refuge. It was an ambush. I was back in the forest, but I wasn't walking. I was everywhere at once, drifting like smoke through the trees. Down below, I could feel the trail, a quiet hum in the earth. I looked up through the tangled mesh of branches and saw it. The sky wasn't filled with stars, but with a slow, shifting river of light, a colossal living pattern of soft golds and deep, shadowy violets, moving with an old, unhurried intelligence. There was no sound, but my mind filled with a feeling, a deafening sense of being watched, of being measured and understood by something as vast and indifferent as the space between galaxies. It didn't feel threatening. It was worse. It was simply there. And it knew I was there too. I woke up with a jolt, my heart pounding hard against my breastbone. The cabin was cold and dark. Rain pattered steadily on the roof. The dream was already fading, leaving behind not pictures, but the deep, bone-chilling feeling of its presence. The feeling of being known. I sat up, my skin slick with sweat, and stared into the darkness. The little piece of fabric was still on the microscope stage across the room, a tiny glowing ember in my memory. I had let it in, and now I had a terrifying, unshakable feeling that it had no intention of leaving. Sleep did not return. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the rain and the frantic thrum of my own pulse. The feeling from the dream, that sense of being perceived, of being categorized by something vast and indifferent, it didn't fade. It coiled in the pit of my stomach, a cold certainty that I had drawn a terrible kind of attention. My protocol, the rules hammered into me by my predecessor, was clear: contain, conceal, never engage. But staring into the oppressive black of my cabin, with the memory of those luminous geometric patterns burning behind my eyes, I knew the protocol was no longer enough. I had a piece of it now. It had a piece of me. The thought was a parasitic vine wrapping around my reason. I had to go back. The notion was insane, a flagrant betrayal of every survival instinct I owned, but it wasn't a choice, not really. It was a compulsion, a thirst that had settled so deep in my bones that ignoring it felt like ignoring the need to breathe. I told myself it was for reconnaissance, that I wouldn't go near the trail itself, just the perimeter where we found Amelia. I was a ranger, an expert navigator. I could get close without being consumed. It was a lie, but it was the one I needed to get my truck keys off the hook by the door. The drive back to Sector 9 was a descent. The perpetual Pacific Northwest gloom seemed thicker, the mist clinging to the road like a shroud. The towering firs and cedars weren't just trees anymore. They were silent sentinels, their moss-draped branches reaching over the asphalt like the bones of ancient, patient creatures. Every mile brought me closer to the epicenter of the wrongness, and with it, a strange dual feeling of absolute terror and a profound magnetic pull. I left the truck hidden in a dense thicket a mile away from the search area and moved into the forest on foot. I didn't use trails. I used the land, a compass, and the quiet, ingrained knowledge of a life spent in the wild. I circled the area, tracking the phantom path by the subtle disturbances in the terrain that only a trained eye could see. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, tinting the air a bruised purple, I saw it. The dust. It wasn't just on Amelia's jacket anymore. It was here, a faint, golden sheen on the dark, wet bark of a Douglas fir, a delicate, shimmering coat on the fronds of a sword fern. The closer I got to the invisible line of the trail, the more prevalent it became, until the very air seemed to hold a faint metallic glimmer. I found a place where a fallen giant had torn a small wound in the canopy, a ragged skylight looking straight up. The temptation I'd been fighting all day finally won. I stopped, my boots sinking into the soft loam, and tilted my head back. For a moment there was nothing but the darkening sky. Then it resolved. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't an object or a creature. It was a movement in the space between the branches, a silent flowing geometry of light and shadow, a living pattern, impossibly complex, shifting and folding in on itself with a grace that felt ancient and absolute. It was sacred, and it was obscene. It felt like watching a god think. And as I stared, I felt it look back, not with eyes, but with its entire being. It knew I was there, a tiny, fragile node of consciousness, and it poured a feeling into me. Not a voice, but a wave of profound, serene understanding. A promise that all the frayed edges of my mind, all the guilt and the fear could be smoothed away. All I had to do was step onto the path, look up properly, and let myself be known. The pull was immense, a siren song of pure, intellectual bliss. A surge of animal panic, hot and sharp, broke the spell. I tore my gaze away, a physical act of violence against my own will. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard. I didn't stop to get my bearings. I just scrambled away, half crawling, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I fled, running from a sense of peace that felt more dangerous than any predator. Hours later, I was back in my cabin, the door bolted, my body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. I lurched into the bathroom and braced my hands on the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, scratched, and wild, but it was my eyes that held my gaze. In the harsh glare of the single bulb overhead, I could see it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A tiny, luminous sliver, a crescent of unnatural, metallic color, just beginning to eclipse the familiar brown of my iris, the first stroke of gold.